I study democratization, comparative democratization. My research mostly is about how different types of government, so democracies, authoritarian governments, primarily how they make development policy, agricultural policy, and food policy, and the effects that that policy has on the stability of their regimes. I think many people understand that there is a correlation or an association between more developed countries or more rich countries and democracy. So we know that the more developed countries of the world in Western Europe and North America tend to also be democratic. And we take that for granted, and I think many members of the public also would inherently sort of agree with that statement. But for that reason, in comparative politics, there's a massive body of scholarship about trying to explain why that is. Why, as countries develop, why they become richer, they also tend to become democratic. Most of the scholarship on agriculture and development under authoritarian governments, so the treatment of the agricultural sector on the path from less developed societies to more developed societies. Most of the scholarship is focused on the fact that these governments tend to keep food prices low. They tend to keep food prices low to try and provide cheap food to urban residents, which is a fairly intuitive and compelling story. But what I've found in my research is that when we account for the influence of rural elites, then even authoritarian governments can follow policies which are quite conducive to agricultural development and support the agricultural sector. So that might not sound like a particularly great insight, but it has quite far-ranging consequences for the way that we view the process of development and democratization. Because in order to get from a less developed society to a developed society, you have to have this transition away from an agricultural economy to a developed industrial economy. And the way that that process is shaped by authoritarian governments is critical to the political outcomes that we see along this trajectory as well. And so we've always thought that authoritarian governments, by keeping food prices low for this clear political reason of buying off urban food consumers and urban elites, they've tended to hamper the development process, and that has tended to perpetuate authoritarianism, because these countries, particularly in Africa and Asia, they were stripping resources out of the agricultural sector in order to privilege urban areas, and that meant that agriculture wasn't developing, so the countries weren't developing, so we weren't seeing political change. But what I'm trying to argue in my research is that that's only one constellation of political interests and policy outcomes under authoritarianism, and that there's another end of the spectrum where landed elites are more powerful, and we see a different set of agricultural policies being followed. I was very interested when I started looking more closely at the relationship between these food policies and urban unrest, because I thought that in countries, authoritarian countries where the government was increasing food prices or not decreasing them significantly, that these regimes would be more susceptible to urban unrest, that you would see food riots and you would see higher levels of discontent in the cities where people were dependent on food markets but were facing high prices, and they were facing high prices because the government was keeping the prices high. I thought that there would be a very clear association between those policies and urban unrest, but I didn't find such a clear-cut relationship actually. What I found was that the effect of these sorts of food taxes on political unrest in cities was actually contingent upon broader political regime structures. So under the most repressive authoritarian governments, we don't see a response to higher food prices or higher food taxes in the form of urban unrest, because they are so repressive that people can't take to the streets and challenge the government in any case. So that was a fairly sobering result of my analysis in that case. I went to graduate school in Minnesota wanting to study agricultural trade, but I thought I wanted to study agricultural trade among developed countries. But then I learned that actually there's a large role for the agricultural sector in the democratization process that's not that well explored, and in particular, in particular, the fact that I wanted to study agricultural trade policy made me very sensitive to the fact that agricultural markets are heavily distorted by governments. And the story about the agricultural sector and our stories of democratization tends to revolve around the power of these landed elites and how they try and hold back democratization because they have preferences for authoritarian government. But the literature didn't talk about the fact that these agricultural markets that these landed elites are producing for are heavily, heavily distorted by governments. And so that seemed to me like a really key part of the story of how development led to democratization and how rural elites related to authoritarian governments that was really underexplored. That we can't just think about rural elites existing in a vacuum in terms of the markets that they operate in, but that the income and the profits of these sorts of actors is heavily politicized and dictated by government policy from the outset. My dissertation was about this relationship between political regime type and agricultural policy and its effects on political stability. And I finished that in 2014 in Minnesota. I did win a prize for my dissertation from the American Political Science Association, and that was incredibly gratifying and made me think that perhaps my work was more interesting to a broader audience than I realized. And I think that was a real moment when I realized that there might be a place for me in the discipline that I could feel quite comfortable in. I was lucky when I was at the University of Minnesota that there was a group of people who were working on democratization. David Samuels and Ben Ansell were writing a book at the time when I was there on the relationship between inequality and democratization that really influenced my thinking a lot, and I was able to have some really stimulating conversations with them. My advisor, John Freeman, was also working on a project on financial liberalization and modernization and democratization, so he also had a big impact on the way that I think about democratization. And so I was really lucky when I was in Minnesota that there was a community of people that were working on similar topics to what I was interested in, and I was able to build off of their research in some ways, and we were able to, I guess, learn from each other a little bit. In terms of data, I have used a lot of data which has been produced by the World Bank. Okay. So I mostly use observational data produced by the World Bank on agricultural policies around the world, and that has been invaluable actually. Without these World Bank research projects that have put together these data sets, I probably wouldn't have been able to do a lot of the research that I've ended up doing. So I was lucky that when I entered graduate school, some of these data sets were just being finished. I think actually, yeah, I think the data set that I used in my dissertation, heavily used in my dissertation, was only completed in 2009 or 2010, and I started the project a couple of years later. So that was quite a fortuitous coincidence, I guess. I'd say that agricultural policy continues to be quite interesting. For example, in Britain at the moment, they're having to completely rethink their agricultural policy because they're leaving the European Union, so they're leaving the European Common Agricultural Policy, and it's going to be very interesting to see how that plays itself out, the process of lobbying and policy formation in Britain post-Brexit. At a more macro level, I'd say that agriculture has been one of the sticking points of multilateral trade negotiations over the last 20 years. Agriculture was only really included in trade negotiations at the World Trade Organization at the end of the 90s. And since then, we haven't had very good progress on trade negotiations at the multilateral level. So we've seen the splintering and proliferation of trade deals along regional and bilateral lines, and the interests of developing countries in more favorable agricultural trade deals, and the resistance of developed countries to favorable terms of trade in agriculture because of their desire to protect their farmers domestically, have been major roadblocks to progress in multilateral trade negotiations. And if we think about the breakdown in the multilateral world order more recently and decline of people's faith in free trade, perhaps you could say that the the lack of progress at the multilateral level at the World Trade Organization because of agriculture has played a role in the decline of people's faith in globalization and trade liberalization around the world, perhaps in some way. I think that for a long time, international trade was governed by multilateral institutions, and that tended to progressively liberalize trade, and this was seen as a good thing. That is not progressing as fast anymore. We're seeing more bilateral trade agreements, and we're seeing more bilateral negotiations on trade, and it seems that there is more potential for conflict in those sort of bilateral relationships than there was in the multilateral institutions. So I think that one of the things that my research really uncovers is that under authoritarian governments, there are a range of reasons for them to intervene in the agricultural sector heavily for reasons that we perhaps didn't grasp previously. That isn't particularly good news for multilateral trade negotiations and the liberalization of trade, because it means that there are powerful domestic political reasons for a wide range of governments to resist lessening their interventions in the agricultural sector. So that's going to mean that we're going to see more resistance to trade negotiation at the global level. I think that uncovering the sources of that resistance perhaps will help us to understand why we are not seeing more moves towards global free trade. But I would also say that my research doesn't cause me to be particularly optimistic about the chances for moving decisively in that direction in the future. In fact, perhaps the opposite.